Karl, you know the difference between right and left, don't you?
Yeah, you're on their right.
Okay.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Susan Eisenhower, and it's a terrific pleasure to be here today to have a conversation with Dr. Lynne Cheney and Karl Rove. This is a real honor for me, and a real treat to be able to have a kind of an intimate conversation about the executive power in the United States, to actually wield power alongside of the President of the United States, and also to talk about what it's like to be behind the scenes. Let me just say very quickly, if I cough, I'm not sick. I'm having a little...
I don't know, you came back from Wuhan with that cough, and I was a little worried about it. You feeling all right?
Oh, yeah. Right,
oh, you're a little
thank
warm.
you. Yeah.
A little warm. Lynn, you want to change? I think the two women ought to be here, and I ought to be up.
I had to clean up somebody's fireplace flue the other day and inhaled some fire smoke. So in any case, don't be alarmed if I find myself coughing. Let me just say that it's really a thrill to talk to you again. And as I had some experience as a child with what it's like to be in the company of people who wield enormous power, to observe both the pressures of the job along with the loneliness, you might say, of power, and obviously it comes with privilege, but also great sacrifice. Lynne, you have said over time that you have carved out a remarkable career for yourself. But this proximity of power probably started for you when your husband, Dick Cheney, became chief of staff to Gerald Ford.
And I didn't see him for 2 years.
Is that right?
It's that's just sort of the way it is. But I was so interested in what he was doing that he learned to come home at night and tell me what he'd done all day. And so that's a really fascinating inside look. You and I were joking before. If you're the President of the United States, you're called POTUS. If you are the First Lady of the United States, you're called FLOTUS, First Lady of the United States. If you're the wife of the Vice President, you're called SLOTUS. And my family had an enormously good time with that. I had to finally shut it off before they did in public.
Well, have you been tempted to turn it into a Twitter handle?
There you go. I don't think that I really feel comfortable with Twitter. I'm always afraid I'll send something that I don't know I sent, and that's not a good idea.
Good point. Good point. That's right. So, Karl, you've been in an enormously powerful position in the White House, and I have to ask both of you, if you don't mind. I think we're badly in need of humor today. I don't know if all of you agree, but I'd like to know what the funniest and the strangest thing ever happened to you while you were in the White House arena.
Me?
Yes, you.
Well, there were a lot of them, but I stole a car. I think that was the highlight.
Oh, my.
So...
now, was that funny or was that stupid?
Oh, it was very funny.
Okay.
It was enormously
All right.
funny because I had this colleague, Al Hubbard, head of the National Economic Council, very successful business guy, originally from Jackson, Tennessee. So he spoke with this sort of southern accent and sort of like sounded like a sort of a slow-minded guy from Jackson, Tennessee, hiding the fact that he had a Harvard MBA and they had started at a very young age with a private equity partnership in Indianapolis that was wildly successful. He basically, their strategy was buy the last buggy whip manufacturers in America, consolidate them, and make a lot of money, and they did. And he stepped aside from that to come in and serve as the National Economic Council director. And he had a really nice BMW, really nice.
Uh-oh.
And, you know, if you're at the White House, you're spending a lot of time in meetings. And I had a meeting across the way from the West Wing in the old executive office building. And it ended early, and I had a few extra minutes before my next appointment, and I was walking down the Navy stairs and across what's called Old Executive Drive. Mm-hmm. It's this street that is between the West Wing and the Ike, the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. And right by the entrance to the basement of the West Wing, Hubbard had parked his car, and I noticed he'd left his keys in it. So I got in it and moved it up West Executive Drive. Now, remember, to park on West Executive Drive, you have to be a senior aide to the president. You go through 3 checkpoints manned by people with automatic weapons. Your car is swept for bombs, and you pass over some kind of a device embedded in the concrete that I don't know what it does, but maybe it x-rays you. I don't know. But so this is very secure. So I took the car and drove it up West Executive Drive about 75 yards. And after 9/11, they had the sniffer trucks. They had 4 trucks, they looked like ice cream trucks that were parked at the 4 corners of the complex, and they sampled the air for chemical and biological agents. And it was just large enough that when I parked the car behind it in a vacant space, you couldn't see it from the West Executive entrance. So I wasn't there, but I have eyewitnesses who said at the end of the day, Hubbard came out, took a look around, couldn't see his car, took out his flip phone, hit the speed dial to his assistant, and said, "Dougie, my car is gone. They've stolen my car." Now, he found it. So the next morning, of course, at the senior staff meeting, with a sort of a tone of an edgy tone, but nonetheless good-natured, he accused me of stealing his car. Big mistake.
Oh.
So I kept stealing his car. So, and I'd work it out so that, like, one time I worked it out with the Secret Service so that I parked it by their loading dock. Can you imagine that call? Mr. Hubbard, your car is blocking the loading dock, and we're expecting a load of surface-to-air missiles. Would you please come? Anyway, this went on for a great deal of time, and it was enormously fun. And every time that I'd steal his car, he would accuse me of it at the senior staff meeting. But after the first time, I would always get somebody else to be in the car with me. So when he said, "You stole my car, I really don't appreciate it," I'd say, "Al, I don't know what you're talking about, because I saw somebody else get out of your car," which was true, because I got him to get into the car with me. So long story short, final week that I'm at the White House, we're flying back from Reno, Nevada, where the president's spoken to the American Legion, and we finally had television then on Air Force One, and I'm watching television, and I'm sort of mystified because there is a camera at the corner of the White House on what's called Pebble Beach, and when you see the north portico of the White House, that's being shot from Pebble Beach. Only the camera's not looking to the White House. It is swiveled around and looking down Executive Drive, and it's looking at a car that has messages spelled out in Post-it notes on all the windows, colored Post-it notes forming letters and words. And then somebody has wrapped the car in industrial cellophane, giant sheets of industrial cellophane, and decorated it with stuffed animals. And it's my car. And CNN is saying, we don't know what's going on West Executive Drive, but someone's car has been, and whose car is that? And eventually it's like, well, we've been told on good authority that it's the senior advisor, Karl Rove's car. We don't know what is going on. So I get back to the White House. I call up Hubbard. I say, "Hubbard, fantastic, man. What a great, you paid me back. For every time I stole your car, you paid me back. I got the White House photographer on West Exec. I want to get a picture of you, me, and your handiwork." Now, first of all, he doesn't say, like, "Hey, I did it." But finally, he fusses up that he's done it. And I said, "Look, this is the greatest thing you've ever, nobody's ever come close to this. So we got to have a photograph." So it comes out, we send word through the White House, and people come spilling out of the Ike, and people come spilling out of the West Wing, and it's about 6 o'clock in the evening, and people start applauding Hubbard, and the photographer's having difficulty with his camera, and people are coming out and they're applauding Hubbard, and Hubbard's starting to get into it. He's sort of, he's sort of a modest guy, but he's going like, "Yes, I did this. Isn't this fabulous? Really fantastic." Up walked 2 uniformed division officers of the Secret Service and put them in handcuffs. And then the White House photographer takes the picture. And it really creeps Hubbard out. It's one of my favorite photographs, and it creeps Hubbard out that I keep it in my bedroom. So there's a picture of Hubbard being put in handcuffs and like, "Am I really in trouble? Or is this funny?" And these 2 officers, because look, I was the mayor of the West Wing. These were my people. And so they're putting him in handcuffs, and I'm like, "Oh, buddy, you got me, but I just got you back."
So it's good to know that there's a sense of humor amid all of the pressure.
Yeah, you have to.
Yeah, so, the White House and the Vice President's house, these are very formal places. There's a reason why there's a downstairs official area, and then the living quarters upstairs, because there really is a difference between this public life and this private life. What about you, Lynne? I'm sure you have many funny stories, but have you had strange ones as well from that period?
Well, this is funny and strange.
Funny and
Uh,
strange.
we spent a lot of time at Camp David, as Karl knows, after 9/11. It was the undisclosed location. And we had our kids, and it's the same as Karl's story in the sense that, you find joy in life even though you're in a dreadful time. We also had our dog, a big Labrador yellow lab named Dave. And Dave was the love of our life. And so we took him everywhere at Camp David. Dogs are allowed everywhere at Camp David. Except one day, okay, Karl, help me. Is it Laurel where we eat?
Yeah.
Okay, at Laurel Lodge. Dick walked in, and he had Dave with him. And there's Alma Powell sitting here, maybe Joyce Rumsfeld over here. And Barney, who is the president's dog, and a kind of mean little Scotty. Is that fair?
Mean little bastard is what I would say. He used to bite me all of the time.
Yes. And so
The son
Barney,
the president never had, Barney.
well, Barney was a troublesome dog, but Dave thought he was probably a squirrel because he was kind of little, and so he set out after him. And Barney, being chased by Dave, is going round and round this table at high speed while Alma, Powell, and Joyce are going like this. And the president walks in, and he said, "What is going on here?" And Dick, knowing this probably wasn't a good thing to have Dave chasing Barney, pulled a donut or something off the breakfast trays, said, "Dave, come." And Dave always came for food. So he got the donut, he got Dave out of there. And we went back to our lodging, and 10 minutes maybe, a fellow knocks on the door. He's in full dress uniform. He's the camp commander. And he said, "Sir," to Dick, he said, "Sir, Dave is not allowed in Laurel again." And obviously he'd been sent by the president to tell us not to bring Dave to Laurel again. But the president was really nice about Dave, but not about Dave chasing Barney. That was not permitted.
Well, this is, pets play an enormous role. During my grandparents' tenure in the White House, they brought Heidi, a Weimaraner, and then Heidi had an accident on one of Mamie's rugs and got sent into exile in Gettysburg. I've also got to say that one unknown fact about the White House is the burial ground of our pet parakeet, who was on the third floor, named Pete, and Pete died, so we were allowed to give the bird a dignified burial in the Rose Garden, and we put up a little, my siblings and I put up a little, Pete, rest in peace. But they took it down to mow the lawn.
Oh.
I know, so,
You got to wonder, Roosevelt, who's the first guy who has the West Wing, also had a gigantic collection of animals. His children and he had an enormous collection. You have to wonder how many of them, we know that several of them died during their days in the White House. You have to wonder about the burial location for all the presidents of their favorite pets, because most of them are like, well, of course I'm going to have it buried at the White House. So
well, exactly. But
we ought to have an archaeologist go over the grounds.
I think
Well,
so. The problem is you can't go back and visit their gravesite, so.
Yeah.
Well, except Dave is buried at the vice president's residence.
There we
Oh,
go.
no.
And we're sure we know where the site is, and if we ever are invited back to the VPR, we will go visit dear Dave.
Does he have a little headstone?
No, we thought that was too showy.
A little too showy. Okay, so I'm feeling better about
He
the
has
fact
one
that-
in our hearts. Apropos of that, one of the interesting things to me was how important both the vice president's residence and the White House are to the political and policy business of the government.
Right.
And both the Cheneys and the Bushes were enormously good at entertaining a lot of people, both formally and, more importantly, informally. And it's a little bit problematic for staff, because if you're going to have 20 members of Congress down, you've got to have some staff there too to sort of jolly them up, and they all come down with lists of things that they want to have done, and it's easier for them to give it to you than to give it to the president. But it was amazing to me, particularly at the holidays, how eclectic, you'd have the party for the press, and you'd have the party for this. But it was really interesting, the vice president's residence and the president's, when there'd be holiday parties that were clearly geared towards, their official business and their friends. And it really was important how many a time, you'd have some hard-nosed Democrat who'd be down at the White House smoking a cigar on the Truman balcony, and their spouse would be jumping up and down on the Lincoln bed. And, you know, it may not have gotten their vote, but it helped establish sort of a sense of community. And after we left the White House in the years since, I cannot tell you how many Democrat members of Congress that I've run into who said, you know, if you told me that I'd spent more time at the White House with a Republican president, your guy, than my guy, I'd be surprised. But they did, and it was because the vice president and the president both knew the vice president from having been at the White House as chief of staff, and the president as having been the governor of a state with a Democratic speaker and a Democratic lieutenant governor and a Democratic majorities in the legislature, how important it was to do what you could informally to reduce some of that tension.
Well, I think that's an extremely important point, and I know that it's virtually a given that we all recognize that we're living in tremendously turbulent and uncertain times. I think we have to all recognize that. But I must say that the 2000s were also very turbulent and uncertain. And of course, what immediately comes to mind is 9/11, this extraordinary moment in American history when so much changed for this country. I have to ask you, Lynne, what was that like to actually be trying to, first of all, you were in a high-ranking position during those years at the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I wonder what that was like also to be supporting your husband and to be, you know, a symbol of this country during that tumultuous time.
You are such a nice interviewer, and I'm going to make a public confession that I have never made before. I was getting my hair done. And the nice fellow who was doing my hair came out and he said, you know, a plane just flew into the World Trade Center. I said, ooh, what a weird accident. And then a few minutes later, he came back and said, there's a second one. So, of course, the Secret Service hustled me off into a car. And you could see smoke from the car. It was the Pentagon burning. But you don't know what it is. You just see it coming up from over the buildings. Inexplicably, to this day, they took me to the White House, which everyone else had just evacuated. But it was, you know, such a memorable day being down, it's called a PEOC, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. To be in the PEOC and, you know, watching the country be run, watching Manny Lujan shut down all the planes in the United States. And do it, you know, with great command, so it happened fast.
Norm Mineta.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Norm Mineta, who's a good friend of this day. Thank you, Karl. Condi Rice was there. I don't think you were off with the president, I think.
Yeah.
But it was the same experience Karl had, only more serious. On the way to the PEOC, there are a bunch of cabinets along the way. And you watch the Secret Service opening the cabinet and grabbing very large guns, you know, and passing them on. It's like a movie. That was stunning to me. And then when the day was over, I did take notes that day, which, you know, were subpoenaed or whatever. But it was okay with me. I didn't write anything secret. And moreover, I was shaking so much. I didn't even know I was. They're barely legible. But I didn't miss those. At the end of the day, we flew in a helicopter to Camp David. And when you lifted off the south lawn, you could see the Pentagon. You could see the fire burning. And I couldn't help but think of the burning of Washington in Madison's time. Washington, of course, then was just a small village, and this was of much greater consequence. But it certainly is a day lodged in memory.
Yeah. What was it like after that? Because you go to an undisclosed location, but was it
Think about that for a moment.
Yeah.
Just think about that for one moment. The decision is made that the threat is so unknown and so dangerous that the President and the Vice President of the United States cannot be in the same place unless absolutely essential, that the Vice President must be taken to an undisclosed location, that in the event the President is dead, we have continuity of government. That was the nature of that moment.
That's incredible.
There were worries afterward about airborne poisons that might get us, anthrax, ricin was talked about.
That's when the sniffer trucks show up.
Yeah.
And then they make their way around the White House staff. They walk in and say, they have a little device. They punch a button and it makes a noise. And they say, if you hear this noise, it means that it's a chemical attack. Then they handed me a big plastic bag. They said, this is your mop suit. Take it out and put on the helmet and the mop suit. If you hear this sound, it's a biological attack. And what you need to do is take this needle, stab yourself in the heart, and then put yourself in the mop suit. And I said, sure, like that's going to happen. And and my assistant, Susan Ralston, is standing there listening to this lecture. And I said, okay, where's her outfit? And they said, we have a limited number of suits. It'll be several days before we have more. And I told it to, handed mine to Susan and said, okay, don't tell me when you stab yourself in the heart.
No
was
advance warning necessary. Yeah. I don't quite understand that. Could you help us with that?
What?
Stabbing oneself in the heart?
It's adrenaline. You
it's
stab
adrenaline.
Yourself,
Okay.
You stab yourself in the heart. To sort of,
And you can run then.
yeah. Or maybe it was chemical. You stab yourself, and biological. You have to hope you don't.
Well, my
Hang around
claim
people
to,
who are coughing from their visit to Wuhan.
What, I can't, Lynn, I can't help but ask, what is it like to be in an undisclosed location? I mean, was it massively isolating? I mean, you can be around people all the time and still be very isolated.
I was writing.
You were
And
writing.
it was actually perfect. I sometimes describe my life as one long interruption. But, this was a peaceful place where you could write. Our grandkids were there. Our children were there. So, that part of it was not onerous. But knowing the state of the country was.
Yeah.
And I was going to say a minute ago, I think I have the distinction of being on Cipro longer than any other human being because it was thought to protect you from anthrax and other things that might be in the air. 90 days. And when I tell physicians that, they say, oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
I think I can still use it, though, to effect.
Yeah.
What do you remember about that day, Karl?
Everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
It's 8:48 a.m. I'm standing 15 feet away from the president outside of Emma Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. And the phone rings, and it's my assistant, Susan. And she says, a plane has flown into the World Trade Center. We don't know if it's jet or prop, commercial or private. And I said, what else do you have? And she said, that's it. I said, call me back if you have more. And I walked over and told the President of the United States, who was shaking hands with parents and teachers and administrators. About 2 minutes or 3 minutes later, Condi Rice, National Security Advisor, called with exactly the same sketchy information. And we walked into the elementary school, walked down a long hallway, walked into a classroom which was designated the staff hold. And wherever the president travels, a day or so before he arrives, the Air Force shows up with 2 large cabinets, plastic cases, and take out a device, 2 devices that look like a cross between a typewriter and a telephone. They're called STUs. They're secure telephones. They plug them in to a wall outlet. You hit O, and you're talking to a guy under Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, and they can connect you like that with anybody in the world and secure conversation. So we walk in, and there are the STUs. There's the president's doctor, physician, and nurse carrying a little cooler full of the president's blood. The National Security Advisor's office had a person on the travel team that day. The CIA briefer was a young guy named Mike Morrell,
Oh, yes.
who later becomes the director of the CIA. And the president almost immediately leaves the room and goes into the adjoining room for a reading demonstration with 3rd and 4th graders. Normally there's a television set, but for some reason there was no television. So I spent the opening moments of the War on Terror running up and down the corridors of this elementary school until I could find a classroom with a television set that was empty. And I went in, and it was on the rack, so the Rugrats couldn't get up and play with it. And I pulled it out of the wall and ran down the corridor to the staff hold, rolled it in there, plugged in the power, but then I had to plug in the cable. And I'm rolling around on the floor in a suit in a kindergarten classroom and rolling it and trying to make a connection, plugging it in. And I remember the first, there were 3 outlets. And the first one, it made the connection and it went, and so I had to unscrew it, screw it in the second one. When it made a connection, went, and a voice says, what have we just seen? What have we just seen?
Oh, my.
second plane flying to the World Trade Center. And Chief of Staff Andy Card at that moment decides he needs to go tell the president. And I remember that Andy walked over to the door. Literally, the president is in the adjoining classroom. And I remember when he got to the door, he paused, and it seemed like an eternity. I bet it was like 1001, 1002, 1003. But at the time, I remember he got to the door, and he paused. And I never understood until a couple years ago, we happened to be on a panel talking about 9/11. And he said when he got to the door, he suddenly realized he needed to know exactly what he was going to say so that the president would not ask any questions.
Oh.
So so he had to formulate what he was going to say. And you remember the famous photograph where he tells the president about the second plane flying to the World Trade Center, and then America's under attack. And the president had to make a decision. Should he stand up and walk out, excuse himself and walk out? He thought the reading demonstration was going to be, a matter of seconds, maybe a minute or two at most from being concluded. So he, rather than standing up and excusing himself in the middle of it with, 40 TV cameras and stuff, he decided that he would wait until it finished. But it actually took 4 or 5 minutes. Can you imagine sitting there waiting for this to end, knowing that, So he got up when it ended, quickly excused himself, came into the room. I've known him a long, long time, but a different guy came walking through that door. There was a certain anxiety in the room, and he came in and he was cold as ice and very calm and low tone of his voice. And he said, "We're at war. Give me the director of the FBI and the vice president." And we jumped on the stews. We got Mueller, Robert Mueller, the FBI director, but we couldn't get Vice President Cheney because he's being moved. Secret Service agents have burst into to his West Wing office and have told him they need to move him to the PIAC, the bunker. And but I had a weird day because when we were sitting there, the president is sitting at a table meant for kindergartners. All the adult furniture is gone from the room. So he's sitting at a little table meant for kindergartners. It's about this far off the ground in one of those little plastic chairs, writing what he's going to say to the country. And three of us, Dan Bartlett, Ari Fleischer, and I are there talking with him about what he's going to say. And Eddie Morenzel, the head of the Secret Service, came in, little guy, not very tall, very slim, very soft-spoken, comes in and says, "Mr. President, we need to get you to Air Force One and airborne as quickly as possible," because they were afraid that the president's whereabouts were known, and they were worried that somebody was going to crash a plane into the elementary school, and they wanted to get him the hell out of there. So we went to the motorcade, and normally I'd be in a car 2 or 3 behind the president's limo, Stagecoach as it was then codenamed. But for whatever reason that day, as we're walking out the door, he turned around, whistled at me, and pointed to the back seat of the car. I spent virtually all of 9/11 with him, that close. And when we got to the airplane, he whistled at me again, pointed to the seat across from him in his private cabin, private office. So I was there. And as we're going to the airport, rather than going 40 miles an hour like the normal motorcade, we're going 85 miles an hour. And nobody's saying anything. Andy Card is on the bench looking at us. The president is on this side of the car. I'm here. Eddie Morenzel's in the jump seat in the front, shotgun, and the driver, and that's it. And we're rolling 85 miles an hour to the airport, and the phone rings. A little phone on the side of the back seat. President picks it up. I can only hear one side of the conversation, but I know it's bad when he says, "Is Rumsfeld alive?" The strike on the Pentagon. And at that moment, I couldn't look at him. And I looked to the side and realized that about 1.5 feet away from us, there was a police car. In fact, there were 4 police cars. I hadn't really recognized they were there, that are maybe 1.5 feet away from the car. And we're going 85 miles an hour, and these guys are matching us that close. I could have, if you could roll down the window, it was there. And later in the day, I said to Eddie, "What was that all about?" Because I'd never seen it before, never saw it again. He said, "We were worried about a car bomber, and we wanted the car bomb to go off 10 or 15 feet further away from the president, give him a better chance of surviving the blast." And my first thought was, what the hell was I doing in the backseat of that car? But that was the day. I mean, the day was, we got on the plane, the president, we lift off, and when we lifted off, literally the plane began to roll when the door is not even shut. We got on the plane, and normally it takes like 10 or 15 minutes to power, get everybody in their seat, and then power it up. We got on the plane, and I'm buckled in across from the president. People are pouring on the door. The last person comes pouring up the stairs. About 5 seconds later, I realize the stairs are disappearing because the plane is beginning to move and they need to get the stairs out of there before the wing clips the stairs. And the door is open. And somebody is screaming at something to somebody that the door is open, and an airman comes running up the hallway, grabs a strap, leans out over 30 feet of air, pulls the door shut and arms it, and we are like rolling. And we get to the end of the runway, and Colonel Tillman flips around this 747 like it is a Piper Cub, stomps on the brakes, powers up the engines, just, they're blowing, and let's go. And we go rolling down there. I've done aircraft carrier landings and takeoffs. That was the closest thing I've seen to an aircraft takeoff. I mean, we roll down that thing, and he gets airborne and stands us on the tail. And I'm looking up at the president like this, trying, yeah, I'm okay. How's your day going? And he's looking down at me like this. But almost, we're heading up the west coast of Florida, and the president says, we're going to Washington. And the vice president calls him from the PIOC. Rumsfeld leaves the fires outside the Pentagon and goes to the command center and calls him, says, don't come back. The president is not a guy who has got a temper, but they're arguing about whether or not to go back to Washington. And they're saying, don't come. We don't know. There may be some guy with a shoulder-launched missile waiting for Air Force One to come to final approach. But the entire day was like that. I'll tell one more quick thing and then stop. The president is sitting there. Andy Card and I are sitting across from him. We've all been on the phones talking to Giuliani, Pataki, everybody. And we have a quiet moment where we're reporting on some conversations, and the phone rings. And I think it was the vice president. And the president listens for a few moments and says, yes. Listens for 10 or 15 seconds more, says, you have my authorization. Another 5 or 10 seconds says, yes. Another 5 or 10 seconds says, you have my authorization, and hangs up. And looks at Andy and I, and in a voice like you are announcing your grocery list, says, I've just given authorization for the military to shoot down any aircraft inbound to a critical target that's not under command of its crew. And I was so shocked, I can't remember exactly what he said next, but he reflected on how horrible it would be to be the pilot who got that order.
Yeah.
Later that day, we flew to Nebraska. They were trying to keep him away from Washington, and got a briefing. And we're looking at a map, giant map, 2 or 3 stories tall, in this bunker underneath the Nebraska prairies, as aircraft are launched from a New Jersey airfield to intersect one of the 7 aircraft inbound across the Atlantic with which they've not been able to make communications. And we're watching to see if these fighters can make contact with the pilot. The aircraft is inbound to Philadelphia, and if they can't, their orders are splash it before it gets to the New Jersey coast. That was 9/11.
Well, I know, and my office was in the White House security perimeter on Lafayette Square, so we all had some sort of public reaction to these events. But the most extraordinary, I'll just say very quickly, is that for a long time, you were not allowed to get up out of your seat if you were leaving a Washington airport. And only in America could you, or they were authorized to shoot the plane down. Only in America would you be going from either DCA, which is the Reagan National Airport, or Dulles, without a translator translating this into multiple languages. And there was a Russian who was starting to get up as we were taking airborne, and thank God I speak some Russian because I told him to sit down right now. But nobody was really prepared for that. So I'd like to ask you, Lynne, I mean, it is an extraordinary thing to be associated with such decision-making, to be an intimate part of this power circle, to wield power yourself in the public's mind, and also by virtue of your relationship to the Vice President of the United States and therefore the President of the United States. What do you do to keep yourself going? Because, we're living in tough times now from a perspective of criticizing other Americans, but I think it was pretty tough back then too, wasn't it?
Yes, but like Karl, you leave with so many stories of the unflappability of the people who were leading us. And, the other end of your story, we were in the PIOC, and I can't tell uniforms very well apart. But the fellow was in white, so I think that means he was Navy.
Yeah.
And
Or the Coast Guard, but yes.
okay, it probably
Unless
not
it was
the Coast
blue
Guard.
and sort of looked like a Navy uniform, and then he's a Coast Guard officer. So
Well, whoever he was a tall, distinguished-looking man, gray-haired, and he came over and whispered in Dick's ear. This is the other end of what you're hearing, and Dick said, "Take it out." It was the airplane. They had come to Dick and said, "What shall we do? We've got this airplane incoming. It's full of people. We have reports that they may hit the Capitol. They may hit the White House." It was a time when we were personally in danger, but I don't remember anybody being shaken by that. However, the Navy captain went away with "take it out," and then he came back. He wanted to be sure that he'd heard right. And so again, Dick said, "Take it out." And I remember that so clearly because I understood what it meant. And as Karl is saying, my goodness, you have a military aircraft shooting down a passenger airliner. I don't think it's a close ethical decision, because if that airliner had gone down in the White House, or if it had
this is Flight
hit the
93
Capitol.
that we're talking about.
Oh, I'm sorry, Karl. That's exactly right. But instead, they went down in Shanksville because the people were very brave.
Not to dwell too much on that, but the as we came back into Washington that night, the president finally, at the end of the briefing in Nebraska, said, "I'm coming back to Washington." And they said, "No, Mr. President, please don't come. We don't know, blah, 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 blah." And he said, "No, I'm coming back. The nation needs to hear me from the Oval Office, not from some bunker under the Nebraska prairie. And besides, I intend to sleep in my own bed tonight," which was sort of semi-jocular, but he wasn't very jocular at that moment. But we flew back to Washington. We were occupied most of the way working on the speech that he was going to give to the country. But about 20 minutes or so outside, 30 minutes outside of Washington, he said, "I'm going to take a quick power nap," and went up front, and the speech was pretty well put to bed. And two of us are standing outside the private office. He's now in the bedroom, which is forward, and we're just sort of talking, and up flies an F-16 aircraft and takes up station at the left wingtip of Air Force One, so close you could make out his face. And we were sort of excited because this is pretty amazing. Up, and there he is. And my colleague said, "Get your camera, take a picture," because I had a little camera that I'd been taking pictures during the day. And I went into the cabin to get it out of my briefcase, and there was one on our right wingtip at two F-16 fighters. And we'd entered what's called the National Capital Airspace, this cordon around Washington that exists even before 9/11. And so we're sitting there sort of excitedly talking about how cool this is, and then suddenly both of us stopped because both of us suddenly realized what this was. This was not a ceremonial escort. These guys were the last line of defense. If something came up out of the ground or somewhere else in space at Air Force One, their job was to put their craft between that threat and Air Force One.
Yeah.
So we come in to land at Andrews, and we come in like this, and we have these two F-16 fighters on our wingtip as we're literally, and again, I'm strapped in looking at the president like this as we come in, and at the last moment, Colonel Tillman pancakes the 747 onto the runway, and as he does, these two F-16 fighters simultaneously turn on their afterburners to push ahead of the craft of Air Force One, and so they boom and like this, 50 feet off the ground. A couple years later, I was walking through the airport in Atlanta, and this trim guy about in mid to late 30s comes up to me and says, "Are you Karl Rove?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "We were together on 9/11. And I said, "Remind me where?" He said, "I was on your left wingtip as you came to
Oh,
the
boy.
National Capital
Goodness.
Airspace."
Isn't that a story?
Yes.
Air Force reservist, a stockbroker, doing his active duty, and on the flight line, the launch line on 9/11, and this was his job.
Wow. I mean, these are this is some very, very moving stories. Well, since we're here at the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, I can't help myself. You have both been at the epicenter of events during the 2000s, a very dynamic period in response to 9/11, of course. We go into Iraq in 2003 and the rest of it. You've both also written history. So I'm wondering how your own personal experiences during this time informs the way you look at historic figures. Does it or does it not at all?
my own personal experience was I was writing a book on education, and I was about halfway through when George Bush asked Dick to be vice president. And the president-to-be, his main cause was education. So I couldn't finish that book. I couldn't go out there with a set of opinions that, might conflict, might not conflict. I couldn't finish the book. So I started writing children's books. I thought, this is the least harmful thing I can do.
Yeah.
Who's going to get mad about a patriotic children's book? And so I wrote, I think, 6 of them while Dick was vice president. It's one of the best things I've ever done. It was that long ago, and people are still giving A is for Abigail in America, patriotic primer for baby presents. I mean, it's my go-to baby present. So it affected my life quite an important way, and I don't think Karl ever knew that.
I'm not going to answer your question directly, but I'm going to tell a Dick Cheney story.
Okay.
So it's June of 2000, and Bush is thinking about who his vice presidential running mate should be, and we're looking at 9 people. And the head of the process is Richard Cheney of Dallas, Texas. And during the course of all of this, Bush becomes convinced that Cheney ought to be the guy. And he knows I'm against it. So he calls me up. He's in Iowa. And he calls me up and says, okay, I'm coming home tonight, as you know. And he said, I want you to be at the governor's mansion tomorrow at 10 o'clock. And I want you to make the case why I shouldn't go with Dick Cheney. So I show up at the governor's mansion at 10 o'clock. And a governor's mansion in Texas was built in 1854 when there were Comanche Indians 20 miles to the west. So it's not very big. So we're in the Austin Library, which is about maybe twice the size of this stage, and I'm sitting on one side of the room, and Governor Bush is sitting on the other side of the room, about 4 feet away, and we're in comfortable chairs, and he says, okay, tell me why we shouldn't go with Cheney. And I said, well, number one, Wyoming, 3 electoral votes. Haven't lost it since 1964, not worried about it. We need to go with somebody from a battleground state. Number 2, Cheney had his first heart attack at the age of 34 or so. I used to know the details of it. And I said, I think he's had 3 since. He's working on perfecting the heart attack. People are going to say he's not going to last 4 years. Number 3, he was a conservative congressman from a conservative state 18 years ago, and every one of his stupid votes is going to be brought up. Like the vote as one of 3 members of Congress to vote against the resolution calling on the apartheid regime of South Africa to move Nelson Mandela from the island prison where there's no doctor to the mainland prison where there was a doctor. 3 guys vote against it. He's one of them. We'll have those. Number 4, we've worked very hard to identify you as your own man, not mini me to your dad. So let's pick the guy who was the Secretary of Defense at a time of war for your father. That's going to erase that. People in the Midwest and the Northeast are concerned about you being an oil man. What the hell? Let's double down, get the guy who's running the world's largest oil field supply company, Halliburton. Let's do that. 12th Amendment problem. Anyway, Bush is not a monologue guy, so this is like World Wrestling Federation. Nobody's going to ever bring up that vote. You're ridiculous, et cetera, et cetera. So this goes on for about 30, 35 minutes. And at the end of it, I literally realized I can't unbutton my jacket because I have sweat through my shirt. This has been like just, he says, got anything else? I said, nope, that's it, sir. Turns to the guy next to him and says, Dick, got any questions for Karl? Cheney had been listening to me kick his ass around for 30 minutes. As we're walking out of the room, he says to me, I agree with some of what you had to say. That night, Bush calls me, and he says, really good today. He was back on the road. He literally came, was there for 6 or 7 hours, met with the vice president, and then left again. Calls me that night, about 10 o'clock, and he says, really good today, really good. You outlined 10 serious political problems. And I hadn't thought of some of them, and it was really good. So figure out what you're going to do about them, because I'm going with Cheney. He said, your job is politics. So these are all political problems. Figure out what you're going to do about them. He said, that's not my job. My job is to figure out who would be the best partner to me in the Oval Office. And if something terrible happened to me, whom would the country have immediate confidence in? And that's Dick. And I'm going with him. Don't tell anybody I've made the decision, or I'll kill you. But figure out what you're going to do, and in a couple of days, when I get back, I want you to be prepared to tell me how we can prepare for each one of these eventualities. And
Karl.
it was a testament to her husband.
I just have to add, we're out of time, is that Dick was the other opponent of his being chosen.
Yeah.
And argued strenuously against it for many of the
Yeah.
same reasons Karl did. And the president finally leaned on him down in Texas on the hot porch of the ranch house until, Dick was sweating and the president was sweating. And finally Dick said, okay, I'll do it.
Yeah, and he never held my bluntness against me either. He could not have been a better colleague and, more importantly, a better mentor.
I'm terribly sorry that we're out of time. I hope you'll agree with me. This is a terrific opportunity to hear from our.
Well, it was fun, Karl.